Hello again. I'm reading from my book, Father of Faith, In the Footsteps of Abraham. And we're up to step 1, leaving all. Terah had already left Ur with the intention of going to Canaan, but settled once he got to Haran. Nevertheless, when the Lord Jehovah gave instruction directly to Abram, he graciously dangled a carrot before his eyes to give him the incentive to progress further. In Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3, God says this: "Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, curse him that curses thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." The Bible does not record what God said to Terah, if indeed God did instigate his journey. But a personal word is of vital importance if we are to walk by faith. This personal word gave Abram the confidence to continue the journey, even though it meant abandoning his father, apparently with no male relatives to care for him. Genesis 12, verses 4 to 5. "So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Abram took Sarai his wife, Lot his brother's son, all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had begotten in Haran. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came." I've heard many preachers criticize Abram for the fact that even though he was instructed to get out of his country, leave his kindred and his father's house, he disobeyed by taking Lot, his nephew, with him. Indeed, they're very quick to criticize many honoured men of the scriptures, such as Elijah and Jonah. But I personally would be very careful about doing something so rash as to criticize someone whom the scripture honours with the titles Friend of God and Father of Faith. Romans 4, verses 11 and 12 says this, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised. In Romans 4, verse 16, "Therefore it is of faith that it might be grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all." Abram was not obliged to look after Lot, for he was not a child. And if he had been, then Terah was well capable of taking care of him. Lot was the son of Haran, who had died in Ur of the Chaldees, and was a businessman in his own right, having inherited his father's wealth. Lot's sister, Milcah, was grown up enough to become the wife of her uncle, Nahor, whilst they were still dwelling in Ur, so there is no chance that Lot was still a child when living in Haran, from where Abram set out for Canaan. Genesis 11:29 says this: "Abram and Nahor took wives. Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Ishkar." Genesis 13, verse 5. "And Lot also, which went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents." Make no mistake, Lot continued the journey with Abram because it was his chosen path. It was his choice. And I'm sure it was with gladness of heart that Abram allowed him to accompany him. It's not easy doing things on your own. When Abram set out to follow the leading of this unknown God to an unknown destination, he had nobody to share his faith with. Nobody around him had heard God speak to them. They wouldn't be able to identify with him. Besides, they had many gods whom they were following, and idols they were worshipping. Why would they want to hear about a God with no name and no visual image? For since the Garden of Eden, God had withdrawn and hidden his form from man. There was no Bible to read from which he could derive inspiration and encouragement, and there were no meetings to attend where he could have fellowship or share testimonies with others who had experienced similar things. No, he was completely alone in his newfound faith. He was leading his family and servants like a shepherd leads his sheep. They didn't know where he was going, but they knew him, and believed that Abram had such a relationship with his God that they were prepared to place their trust in him to do what was right for them. Quite apart from this fact, he was only just entering into this relationship with God and had nothing to fall back on other than the clear words which he had heard and the firm conviction that God had spoken into his heart and made a promise to him. His action of walking out from his father's house, leaving him without any male relatives, proved that he believed that God had spoken to him. He who believes obeys. Abram did not disobey God by taking Lot with him. He was just on the first of many stepping stones, walking in obedience with the limited revelation he had received, believing that this would lead him to his destiny. Abram was in obedience school, and he was to study in that school for 24 long years, being tested and tried by fire before he received tangible proof that God would indeed fulfill the promises to him. Thank God he had a good wife. I don't think it would have been possible to serve this unknown God and live a life of faith if he had been shackled to a complaining, negative female. He had been blessed by being married to a woman who loved him with all her heart. She was a helpmeet, suitable for him. For God knew that in the first part of this walk of faith, they had to carry the candle together until Abram was strong enough in God to carry it alone. There is no record of God ever rebuking Abram for any of the actions he took. The Bible is very explicit concerning the sins of those we are expected to look to as examples of how to walk. Moses, Samuel, David, Peter, to name but a few, were all reprimanded for their particular mistakes. But no rebukes were ever spoken concerning Abram. This in itself should be a lesson. If God thought so highly of him that he would consider him to be his friend, and the scripture states that he is the father of faith for all believers, then we should not touch or judge God's anointed, nor do his prophets any harm. It is not within our jurisdiction to judge another man's servant. Abram was 75 years of age and Sarai 65 when they left Terah, aged 145 behind. It's quite amazing that within a short space of time, Abram actually sets foot in Canaan, the land his father had first set out for, but didn't actually reach. Those extra 500 miles seemed to pass without too much trouble or incident, and it would almost appear that this part of his faith journey apparently came to pass very quickly and without hitch. Although it had been a traumatic experience for him to leave behind a beloved father and all that was familiar to him, seeing before him the land that God had promised to him must have been a tremendous encouragement. He had actually arrived. He was standing on the soil he was to inherit. God must have been very pleased with this act of faith because he personally appeared to Abram and confirmed his word. Genesis 12, verse 7 to 9 says this: "And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there built he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he built an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed, going on still, toward the south." It didn't unduly perturb Abram that the Canaanites still lived in the land. He believed even then that if God promised this land to him, then God would work something out sooner or later. So he was happy to pitch his tent there, dwell amongst them, and wait. There was absolutely no reason for Abram to leave the place God had said he would inherit. He would just wait and hold his ground until the Lord gave it to him on a plate, just like he'd promised. But that wasn't what God had in mind. Before Abram could get what was promised, there were a series of tests he had to go through first to prove his worthiness. He was allowed to view it for himself, even walk through it, but it would not be his, lock, stock and barrel, until he had overcome the hurdles God was now going to place before him. When Jesus Christ gives us a revelation of who God is and tells us to leave all and follow him, it's because he's already been preparing us over a period of time. We will have been spoken to in many ways on many different occasions during our lives, but there comes a time when our feet have to start walking down the path God has led us onto. It can no longer be simply a mental acceptance. It will have to be something we walk in physically. Abram's life was prophetic, and each and every one of us will have to go through a similar process if we are to live a life of faith. The walking away from all we have ever known to serve this new God we have just met can be both frightening and exhilarating in experience. God speaks to us. We can hear him in our hearts and are sure that this is the right path. We encounter many encouragements, and it isn't long before we know we are where we are meant to be. Abram actually walked, slept, ate and drank in the very place God had promised to give him, yet it didn't belong to him. He could see and feel what had been promised to him, but it wasn't actually his. That was for the future, but only if his faith in God would permit him to pay the price God was asking in exchange for the promise to become a reality. First of all, he had to face the wilderness. When we first come into a relationship with God, we also experience our promised land, but we only experience it in our spirits. The kingdom of heaven is within us. It's not something physical and cannot be seen externally. One day it truly will be a reality, but until that day comes, we also have to face the wilderness, for only those who endure to the end shall be saved. God cannot fulfill his promises to us unless he knows what is in the depth of our hearts, and only the heat and dryness of the wilderness can bring this out. Only the loneliness and solitude of the wilderness allows the conditions for our motives to be scrutinized. God knows exactly what he's doing. The wilderness is not a mistake. It is paramount to our eventually inheriting. Our lives as believers mean nothing until we have been tried and tested. Until proven, our faith is just a mere belief that Jehovah is the one and only true and living God, and is no better than the faith that the devil has, for he also believes in God and trembles. We need much more than belief. We need to suffer for what we believe in before we know for a certainty that we really do have faith in God.